Starting off at number 10 now, we have suicidemouse.avi. This is the file name of a supposed unseen episode of Mickey Mouse. Originally, people just thought it was a loop of Mickey walking past 6 buildings before the clip faded to black. He wasn't dancing or smiling, just walking, but other than that, it didn't seem too creepy. Everyone thought there was nothing after that, but when the clip was digitized, people noticed that it was a lot longer than they thought. After a long period of darkness, the clip actually returns to Mickey walking. There was now a gurgle cry in the background that got louder. Then the picture changed. We see the sidewalk go in impossible directions. Mickey's face curls into a smirk. His face then began to fall apart. His eyes rolled to the bottom of his chin like marbles in a fishbowl, and his smile crept up the left side of his face. The screaming noise continued until the 8-minute mark, and then suddenly stopped as it cut to the classic Mickey Mouse fade at the end of every episode, with what sounded like a broken music box playing in the background. The Disney employees who first watched this actually left the room and asked the security guard to watch to the end for them. Legend says they never know what happened at the end because the security guard killed himself soon after, right after repeating the phrase "real suffering is not known" 7 times. They say the file can still be found in the dark corners of the internet under the title suicidemouse.avi. Moving on to number 9 now, we have Squidward's Suicide. Even if you've never watched an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants before, you probably recognize Squidward as a character from the show. He's a sort of grouchy foil to SpongeBob's happy plans, but in this lost episode things took a much darker turn. In 2010, a user posted a creepypasta online called Squidward's Suicide. He claimed he had seen this lost episode during his internship at Nickelodeon Studios. At first they assumed it was just an office prank, but realized they were wrong as soon as they played it. The scene showed Squidward sitting alone on a bed while disturbing music got louder in the background. The scene is spliced with quick flashes of dead children and gore. When it cuts back to Squidward, his face is black with red eyes. Eventually, a strange detached voice tells Squidward to shoot himself with a shotgun. He does just that. He dies and the video ends. Apparently the police investigated all of this, but they couldn't find the culprit who made it, and the video has never surfaced online since. Probably just a creepypasta, but a really good one I think. Next up at number 8 now, we have Man's Best Friend. That's the name of this lost episode of Ren and Stimpy that first aired in 2003. It involves some aspects that the FCC did not agree was suitable for a younger audience. Ren and Stimpy are trained to be better pets. Stimpy is given a cigar-shaped dog treat as a reward. Their owner tells them to not go near the couch, but then says they should so that they can be punished. Ren sort of freaks out and starts sobbing. Stimpy gets yelled at for going on the couch. Their final lesson involves their owner teaching them to protect him. He tells them to attack him with a wooden paddle. Stimpy refuses, but Ren, who's sick of this treatment that day, beats his owner within an inch of his life. The episode was banned and the director lost his job over it. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Dead Bart. According to internet legend, there was a lost episode of The Simpsons from the show's first season. It was entirely written by the show's creator, Matt Groening, who decided to keep it a secret from the rest of his team. Now they say that Matt has the ability to predict the deaths of every guest star who has ever appeared on The Simpsons. He decided to put all of this power on display in this one episode. The episode itself was pretty horrific anyway. It involved Bart dying in a plane accident. The whole family mourned his death for a year, wasting away until they became skeletons themselves. When they visited his grave, every other gravestone belonged to celebrity guests who had appeared on the show before, complete with their name, birth date and death date. And legend says it was very accurate with the people that had already died. Now on top of that, some gravestones even featured people who hadn't been on the show yet. Yeah, that sort of went up a level at the end there. Coming at number 6 now, we have Ed, Edd and Eddy. This is the story of an episode of Ed, Edd and Eddy that accidentally aired on Cartoon Network at 5 AM one morning. Legend says that the animation was choppy, the sound was constricted and muffled. A strange VHS line skittered across the screen. The scenery was described as overwhelmingly dark and depressing without changing props and other background objects looking stormy. The characters seemed agitated and angry. They had tears in their eyes. At one point, the animation switched to claymation. The quality of the episode deteriorated from that point on, becoming almost unwatchable. The episode ended with Johnny swallowing Naz's head as she kicked and struggled. He held her like this until she went limp. A zoom in on his face revealed he had extremely small and very realistic looking human eyes. The camera then shows Eddie's house, and only Eddie's house, for the remaining 3 minutes, and then it cuts to black. Next up at number 5 now we have Candle Cove. This is a famous creepypasta that was shared in the format of an email conversation on a forum. It starts with one user asking if anyone remembers a kids show called Candle Cove that was on TV in the early 70s. Other users start saying they remember it too, and together they piece together the memories to figure out what the show was all about. Candle Cove revolved around a little girl who imagined herself to be friends with pirates. Their ship was called the Laughingstock, and there was another character called Pirate Percy that got scared a lot. Then their memories got creepier. They remembered the ship was a wooden smiling face with the lower jaw submerged. It looked like it was swallowing the sea. Then there was the villain's sidekick, Horace Horrible. His face was just a handlebar moustache above tall narrow teeth. The real villain though was simply called the Skin Taker, a dirty skeleton wearing a brown top hat and cape, his glass eyes too big for his skull. His mouth never opened or closed, his jaw just slid back and forth. When the girl asked him why this was, the Skin Taker told her it was to grind her skin. Then they remembered one episode where the show faded in from black, the camera cut between the characters' faces, and they were just screaming and screaming. The girl was crying, looking like she'd been through hours of this. The story ended with one of the users saying they had just visited their mum at a nursing home. Now she said she was surprised that they remembered the show because when they were little they used to tell her they were going to watch Candle Cove and then they would just tune in to TV static and watch dead air for 30 minutes. Next up at number 4 now we have Akaruyo Bubbles. That's the name of this Lost Powerpuff Girl episode. For those of you that have never seen the show, it's about 3 manufactured superheroes created by Professor Utonium. The story I read about this episode is truly horrific. It involves a twisted experiment which created a terrifying, murderous version of Bubbles. She attacks the screen and ends up dying in the end of the episode, with people staring at her lifeless, mangled body, but she's then brought back to life, only to stare into the camera with angry red eyes. She breathes heavily, the sound gets louder, and then the episode ends in darkness. I've summarized all of that there. The full story is honestly a lot more graphic, detailed, and kinda confusing. The actual episode hasn't even surfaced. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Tom's Basement. This is said to be the name of a lost Tom and Jerry episode from many years ago. Something seemed different right away in this episode. Tom's owner was being physically abusive to Tom, stamping on his tail and telling him to never go down to the basement. Tom and Jerry end up scrapping in their normal way for a while, with Tom getting pretty beaten up. Jerry pushes Tom to the basement door, and when his owner sees him there, he goes ballistic. He screams at Tom in a rage. Jerry appears to take pity on Tom and ends up stabbing the owner repeatedly in his leg. Tom opens the basement door and they carry the owner's body down the stairs. They find dozens of other human bodies there, all showing signs of violent deaths. They shake hands, seemingly pleased that they'd stopped this serial killer, but then an evil look covers Jerry's face. He stabs Tom and throws his body onto the pile. The final scene shows Jerry putting up a for sale sign outside the house and laughing manically. Next up at number 2 now we have Doug's Real Life. Doug was one of the original Nicktoons on Nickelodeon. A few years ago someone shared a story online of them discovering a strange episode of the show that aired in 2005. It started with a normal intro of line drawings, but the characters never appeared. The lines continued as normal, reacting as if the normal characters were there. Doug wasn't narrating his writing like normal though. He just wrote in silence for about a minute before the screen faded out. It came back with large letters that said Doug's Real Life. The episode started with Doug eating breakfast while the screen flashed strangely. It starts again when Doug gets to school. The hallways were full of kids we'd never seen before. It cuts and we see Doug returning home and greeting his dog Pork Chop. Another flash and Pork Chop turned into a hunk of rotting meat. Doug's house looks decrepit too. He walks into the house and talks to invisible people. Another flash and Doug was with his family eating dinner. His mum answers the phone. He thought it was the teacher telling her about him flunking the test that day. He imagined them yelling at him, their faces becoming gigantic and then twisted and red. The screen flashed back to the empty house. Doug was alone, crying and apologizing to an empty room. He went to his bedroom, which was empty except for a book and a pencil. He started writing. This time his voice was narrating. He said, "I can't tell which one is real." And finally, at number 1 now, we have Not Long Enough. This is supposed to be a lost episode of Futurama, one of my favorite shows of all time. The episode starts with Fry, Leela and Bender making a delivery for Planet Express. The planet they land on only has one single house surrounded by empty, desolate fields on all sides. A grotesque alien answers the door. He takes a box from them, he opens it, pulls out a knife, and stabs himself. The crew don't react at all. They simply walk back to the ship in silence. They return to Earth to find New York deserted. Fry walks to the cryogenics building where he had been frozen and begins to cry. He steps inside one of the pods and sets the time to the distant future. The screen fades to black, and when we return, we see that the machine has stopped working. Parts of Fry are decaying. Bone is poking through his skin in several places. "It's what I deserved," he mumbles as he climbs out of the pod. His surroundings are now psychedelic. Strange patterns and colors swirl around him. Eventually, we see that this was all in Fry's mind. His final thoughts before he died. His frozen body is now slumped outside of the cryogenic pod. Bender and Leela walk into the room. Leela says he got what he deserved. She checks her watch and says, "Looks like we need to leave for our next delivery." She takes a knife out of her pocket, places it in a cardboard box, and heads to the ship.
Next off at number 10 is Phineas and Ferb Part 1. Despite gaslighting the hell out of Candace, I really loved this show. Their summer was always exponentially more productive than mine, so I just liked living vicariously through them. The unreleased episode in question today was titled The Horrible Death of Phineas, so we already know it's going to be hella screwed up. Apparently this was the alternative episode to the one where the brothers were finally caught and sent to Camp Smile Away. Either way, the episode starts with the brothers and their gang turning the family car into a flying machine. Meanwhile, Perry infiltrates Doofenshmirtz HQ and he's like, "Dude, I'm over everyone. I'm gonna detonate an atomic bomb on the tri-state area." And he tries shooting Perry a bunch of times while saying so. We cut back to the family's backyard where we see Phineas walking towards his mum to show her his new invention. Then Doofenshmirtz fires at Perry once again, but he dodges, and in a slow motion OC-inspired death, we see Phineas getting shot instead. He's lying in a pool of his own blood, and that is the end of Act 1. Coming in at number 9 is Phineas and Ferb Part 2. Now the tape continues with the words 2 days later flashing across the screen. The shot cuts to Candace in her room singing Yellow Submarine while hanging a rope on the ceiling, which is never a good sign. Jeremy then comes over and asks to see Candace, but when he goes upstairs he sees that she's hung herself, and then he proceeds to kiss her. At this point, Linda comes in and thinks that Jeremy is the one that choked Candace to death, which obviously is not true. Then we see Doofenshmirtz strapped to an electric chair in a state prison surrounded by every other adult in the show. They all cannot wait till he gets executed, and it's actually Perry who switches the chair on, finally getting his revenge. But at the split second right before his death, a series of real photos appear on screen of a man in a lab coat watching a little girl play in the park representing Doofenshmirtz and his daughter Vanessa. Vanessa then starts making out with her own mum, and that's how it ends, with a bit of death and a bit of incest. Just how I like my Disney shows. At number 8 we have Mickey Mouse. Now I never actually watched the Mickey Mouse cartoons from the 30s, mainly because I was born 67 years later, but that's fine. There was one unreleased episode that someone found once the show was released on DVD. The tape shows Mickey in black and white walking past 6 buildings on a continuous 3-minute loop. Then the screen fades out with the sound of a banging piano in the background before that also fades to just annoying white noise. For the longest time everyone thought that's all the tape was, but they were wrong. The tape was actually 9 minutes long, and the tape stays as a black screen until the 6th minute before going back to Mickey. This time the sound in the background is his gurgled cry that gets louder and louder. The sidewalk Mickey is walking on starts warping in ways that defy physics, and he starts. By the 7th minute the cry turns into a scream and Mickey's face begins to fall apart. His eyes roll off his face, his smile becomes even creepier, which I didn't even think was possible. The buildings around him become floating rubble, and the screaming lasts until the 8th minute. After that point, they get cut off and Mickey's face is just there at the end. The last frame had some writing in Russian on it, which translated to "The sights of hell brings its viewers back in." whatever the hell that means. Filling our number 7 slot is Tom's Basement. I absolutely loved watching Tom and Jerry growing up. I feel like I've legit seen all the episodes. It was just funny in a very simple way, and it's an all-time classic. No one can deny that. That's why I was so butthurt when I realized it was on the list, because I was like, no, please, not you too. Now, in the episode titled Tom's Basement, Tom's abusive owner warns him to stay away from the basement. He's so adamant about it that he violently beats Tom if he even so much as sleeps near the door. Jerry sees this and starts using it to his advantage by manipulating Tom into chasing him into the basement and then hiding when his owner comes along. After being the one to get him into shit to begin with, Jerry feels bad and he ends up killing the owner for hurting Tom so much. The duo then hide the body in the basement, but in a Game of Thrones red wedding level betrayal, Jerry then kills Tom as well. Shocking behavior, Jerry, shocking. Now at number 6 are the Aristocats. You guys know I bloody love cats. I'm seriously considering getting mine, a little kitten friend as a companion, but then I'm like, wow, am I really ready for 2 cats? Am I ready for that? Either way, this one comes from this dude that found a VHS recording of the Aristocats as a kid and decided to watch it. Horrified at what he had seen, he refused to ever watch it again, and his mum couldn't understand why the movie terrified him so much, considering it was like PG-5. When the boy got to the 5th grade, he realized his experience of the movie was quite different to everyone else's. He asked his mum if they still had that VHS copy, but she said she'd thrown it away. It wasn't even a retail copy to begin with, she just bought it at an estate sale, but she ended up surprising him with a new copy of it the next day. The boy worked up the courage to watch it again, and it was fine, which he didn't understand. In the version he had watched, the kittens and their mum were drowned, not drugged and kidnapped. The boy just couldn't comprehend why he had seen such a different movie at the age of 5. He asked his friend, who claimed that perhaps he had seen a bootleg version of the film, but till now he never got to the bottom of it. Plot twist, you probably watched a very photoshopped version of the movie. I'm sorry, my friend. You got scarred, and you got scarred good. Coming in at number 5 is Peter's Shadow. I love Peter Pan, you guys, probably obsessively. I saw both animated movies growing up, and the live action one was the movie of my childhood. I've seen it way too many times. I kind of want to watch it tonight too. And I actually always wanted a Peter Pan related tattoo as well, so that may still be in the cards, you guys. You never know. Either way, this family started watching their VCR version of the movie, and the title screen showed the roof of the house just like the normal movie. But Peter, John, Wendy, and Nana are randomly sleeping on the roof, and the family just assumed it was just a glitch and continued watching the movie. When Peter's shadow lands in their room, Wendy looks at it just like the regular movie, but then we hear her blood-curdling scream. Not knowing what the hell was going on, the dad turns off the VCR and tells everyone to go to bed. The girl couldn't fall asleep out of fear and kept having nightmares about Wendy's scream and what the shadow could have done to her. That night at 12:30 a.m, something knocked her nightstand over, but she was too terrified to check it out. I would be the same. I would probably just hide under my covers, never to be seen again until the next morning when it's finally light outside. 30 minutes later, she looks down from her bunk to see Peter's shadow watching her. She ran and slept in her parents' room, and all was well until the next night. She dreamt she was asleep in the desert with Peter's shadow. It seemed to be possessing her mind almost. The girl needed counseling for the rest of her life, and after finding a black paper in her bed that said "him next," her brother then lost his ability to speak. What's up with the shadow? I've never heard of a shadow being that angry, and also how can a shadow look at you? It doesn't have eyes. At number 4 is Mickey and the Flip Mirror. This user found old VHS tapes of TV shows, and one of them was titled Mickey and the Flip Mirror. Now, the first 2 minutes of the tape were black with the sound of waves in the background before Mickey finally comes on screen very briefly. We see Pete's boat pulling into the harbour as Goofy runs to him, clearly very angry and shouting. Pete pushes him into the water because he's pissed as well, and then the screen cuts to Goofy going into Pete's barn and slamming him against the wall, whilst a bunch of hay traps him on the ground. The words 10 minutes before then flash onto the screen, and we see Mickey with all his friends on a hill looking at a mirror. Lightning strikes the mirror then, and the impact sends Donald Duck back way too far, and he ends up falling down the hill as creepy laughter sounds in the background. Mickey is then pulled into the mirror shards by a mysterious hand for a few seconds, and then he re-emerges as this beast-like evil version of himself. It then cuts to Goofy somewhere in town, and he's all cut up and bleeding, and we see evil Mickey dragging him to Pete's barn. barn. There we see evil Donald and evil Goofy step out of the mirror, and then the words "After Pete" flash across the screen. Goofy's covered in his blood, Mickey's lit his boat on fire, and the trio grow even creepier. Mickey's teeth morph into fangs, Donald's beak melts off, and we just see rows and rows of shark teeth, and there's just this loud humming in the background. Behind them, all we saw was the town burning in flames. And that's honestly all I need to see. Filling number 3 slot is Inside Out. I'm not gonna lie, I watched Inside Out on one of my flights back home and I cried so much. If you haven't seen the movie, it's essentially about an 11-year-old girl called Riley and the 5 emotions that live inside her. Now in the movie, her family moved to San Francisco, bringing sadness to the forefront of her mind. The story was shared by an internet Pixar Animations who claims there was meant to be an Inside Out sequel. The intern found a DVD titled Riley.exe, so obviously they put it on out of curiosity. The title card showed up as Inside Out profanity, and it showed the family's house at night. The sound of wind accompanied the shots of Mrs. Anderson crying as her eyes turned into blood balls before falling from her damn face. She eventually passes out from crying blood, and then it cuts to Riley laughing demonically, trying to take happy pills. Her head then spins fully around, and we see that her eyes are black voids, and she has massive teeth. In some Spider-Man fashion, she then jumps out of the window and somehow lands on her feet. As the scene comes to a close, we start hearing the sounds that were played at the end of the Lost Spongebob episode, which I don't even understand. Like, what is the link there? Spongebob is Nickelodeon, this is Pixar/Disney. Either way, the last shot we see is Riley with bloodshot eyes and monstrous teeth standing in the middle of a forest. How did she get there? Nobody knows. Where did she come from? Where did she go? Where did she come from? Cotton Eye Joe. And now, at number 2 is 101 Dalmatian Street Part 1. And if you realize by now, I'm giving the most gruesome episodes 2 parts so I can give you the most detail. Now, I had 101 Dalmatians on VCR, so it was the first Disney movie I ever actually watched, and I loved it so much. So I was very surprised that I didn't know the show 101 Dalmatian Street existed. But either way, the episode was titled Dog Food and started off already creepy as hell. The theme song was distorted and super loud, and the lyrics were also completely different. The screen then cuts to the main characters Dolly and Dylan sitting in a dark room, apparently frozen. Each puppy can then be seen gagged and tied to the wall, and when Dizzy comes inside the room and asks what the hell they're doing, they both say making a snack for Hunter in an extremely deep demonic voice. The eyes then change into a deep green and the whole room lights up in a green fire. Then Dolly and Dylan grab some axes and start murdering each puppy one by one. One puppy, Dorothy, isn't fat enough, so they just end up throwing her out a window, and you'd think it can't get worse, but it frickin' does, you guys. I draw the line at animal cruelty. Okay? And finally, at number 1 is 101 Dalmatian Street Part 2. The scene then cuts to Dolly and Dylan in front of their parents who they've killed and pinned to 2 crosses. Hunter then comes in saying they have to avenge the death of his grandmother, and so the 3 go into the streets of London and murder every single dog they see. The massacre goes on for a whopping 10 minutes before the trio run into Hansel, to which Dylan shouts some homophobic things at. Hunter then tells Dylan to kill Hansel, and he actually listens. He slaughters him with a knife while Hunter eats his remains and grows into an ever more powerful demon. Hunter then shoots Dolly and Dylan in the heads and then eats them too, growing bigger and bigger. The end. I think I've ended on the worst one I read. And that's when you get top 10, the worst one is at number 1 always.
Starting us off at number 10 is Patrick's leg. Now the episode starts off normally and Patrick and SpongeBob go sandboarding, and as Patrick tries to do a trick, he falls and loses his leg. He lets out this shrill scream that's haunting to say the least. Patrick ends up on a wheelchair for a while and girls keep wanting to sign his cast to the dismay of SpongeBob. Either way, that night SpongeBob goes to his house and tells them he can't see those girls ever again, and then they end up fighting, after which he tells SpongeBob that he hates him. Then SpongeBob starts beating Patrick's lost leg with a rock, but the dialogue and animation at this point are not matching up. The screen then cuts to Patrick playing with Jeffrey Jellyfish before going black once again. It then cuts to a CG animation of Patrick cutting SpongeBob's stomach open with some coral and very realistic blood coming out of him. SpongeBob, for some reason now, is laughing maniacally at this moment before everything goes black and the sound of static gets louder and louder. Ugh. Ew. Well. Coming in at number 9 is the bootleg episode. This episode itself is a mix of static, random colors, and black screens. The audio isn't even intelligible, it's heavily distorted and includes some metallic screeches here and there. The tape itself was found by a group of 5 teens back in December of 2004. They were hanging around the back of a mental institution and they happened to find it in its bin. A, why were they hanging behind a mental institution, and B, why were they rifling through the bin? Maybe they deserve to find the tape, that's all I'm gonna say. The tape itself shows SpongeBob slouched over in a dark room and his eyes are bloodshot like he's been crying. 10 seconds later, he takes a bottle of pills from a nearby table while the screen is flickering between light and dark colours. The screams of children come on in the background before going silent as SpongeBob swallows all the pills. He drops to the floor holding his stomach and then starts frothing at the mouth before vomiting all over himself and eventually dying before the screen goes black. No one knows where the tape is now, and the teens that found it are also nowhere to be found. 2 of them committed suicide, 1 disappeared, and the other 2, well, God knows. Maybe only SpongeBob knows. At number 8, we have Squidward's Suicide Part 1. Now, this is probably the most famous Lost SpongeBob episode, hailing from none other than Creepypasta. The story is shared by someone who claimed to be an intern at Nickelodeon Studios back in 2005. The person worked with the editors and animators, and they always reviewed the new episodes before they aired. Sometimes the editors would just put up mock titles as a joke, and one day they saw the title card Squidward's Suicide. Now, thinking it was nothing more than a morbid joke, they decided to play it. Now, it showed Squidward finishing his concert, and then the frames started repeating themselves. The crowd starts booing Squidward maliciously, and it wasn't just the light cartoon-like booing, it was proper booing. You can even see SpongeBob booing the sponge that doesn't have a single mean bone in his body, or sponge, or whatever he is. Squidward is visibly scared, and everyone at this point has very realistic red eyes. We then see Squidward crying on his bed, but the sounds were split with what sounded like laughing, and then just screeching. And then the frames kept glitching. Filling at number 7 slot is Squidward's Suicide Part 2. Now, the lead animation editor rewound the scene frame by frame and saw a picture of a dead boy with an extremely mangled, bloody face. One of his eyes were hanging out and his stomach was cut with his intestines laying beside him. Horror took the room as the frames go back to Squidward, now crying blood. That went on for about 20 more seconds before the screen glitched again and the editor rewound once again. This time it was a little girl in a pool of blood. She was naked except for wearing underwear, and her eye was popped out just like the first boy. Her entrails were piled on top of her, and an intern in the room actually ran out at that point needing to vomit. It's honestly too much. Tears and blood continued to run down Squidward's face, and then all of a sudden the sound of a deep demonic laugh came and lasted 5 frames. When that was rewound, they could see a boy with his entrails being pulled out by somebody's hand. Again, one eye was popped out, and in the end, the last shot is Squidward staring at you with a deep voice saying, "Do it," before he puts a shotgun in his mouth and shoots himself. That's a lot to take in. Now, obviously it's a creepypasta, it's probably fake, but still. Now, at number 6 is the yard sale, shared by an anonymous dad. He said he went to a yard sale a few years ago with his 2 sons, and they ended up buying an old box set of SpongeBob SquarePants. That night, the dad put on the episode for the kids for it to start off as normal. Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? SpongeBob SquarePants, etc., etc. You get the gist. However, 5 minutes into the episode, the screen went staticky and the only sound you could hear was the sound of someone running their nails down a chalkboard. Now I have goosebumps just thinking about that sound, and I didn't even hear it. I just hate it. Then some dialogue came of SpongeBob crying, but it was super distorted. He was saying, "You shouldn't have seen this," over and over again. Then Mr. Krabs comes on screen with his claws cut off and a countdown next to him. He starts counting down from 10 while saying, "If you turn off the tape now, none of you will survive." The kids started crying, the dad was freaking the hell out, and when the timer finally got to 0, the lights in the house went out. When they came back on, both his kids were gone. Coming in at number 5 is Sandy's Revenge. Back in 2006, this episode of SpongeBob apparently aired at 1:34 a.m. It started off with SpongeBob depressed as hell walking to Sandy's tree dome, and his eyes are bloodshot, so we can assume he's been crying. After standing outside her door for 5 minutes, he knocks, and at the 5th knock, Sandy opens the door, looking equally as sad. She lets him in, saying thanks for coming, and just as SpongeBob is about to open his mouth, Sandy lunges at him, strangling him to death. After she's sure he's dead, she ties his body to a wooden board before throwing it out of her house. Apparently, on the edge of a mental breakdown now, Sandy starts screaming as she starts trashing her own house. In the background, in a plot twist turn of events, we see Squidward lying on the ground, and we don't know if he's dead or not. Then he suddenly gets up and runs at her with a fork, but Sandy dodges him and chokes him to death. Sandy, who hurt you? At number 4 is the birthday. This episode comes from someone who was looking for SpongeBob torrents online and downloaded this one titled Sorry, Spongebob. It starts with Squidward playing his clarinet as Patrick opens his door saying it's SpongeBob's birthday and that we're going to surprise him. Squidward then asks who's invited before saying they can't all surprise him. Patrick then says they'd love to, it's going to be so much fun, and then Squidward shouts no angrily before kicking him out, which honestly isn't that out of the blue since Squidward is just annoyed all the time. The screen then goes to black before going to SpongeBob's dark house with all the birthday guests waiting and whispering inside. When he walks in, the lights go on and everyone yells surprise, but the shock is so huge that SpongeBob screams and punches himself in the chest, causing himself to choke. Hyper-realistic blood starts pouring out of the holes in his body before his body finally hits the ground. His friends start screaming and running out of the house as Squidward comes in with bloodshot eyes. All he says is, "Patrick, I told you," before the screen cuts to his funeral. Falling out of the 3 slot is ScarBob Death Pants. Now this person was trying to find a VHS tape for his little sister when he randomly came upon one labeled SBDP. It ended up being a SpongeBob VHS, and when he put it in, it started off with SpongeBob holding a butter knife as Patrick confronted him. Squidward had human eyes at this point photoshopped onto him as he lay on the ground. It then shows SpongeBob coming out of his house, but his house was covered in cuts and bloodstains because apparently pineapples bleed too. The hand that usually pulls his pants off is instead stabbed by SpongeBob. He cuts the hand into tiny bits and pieces before eating it. He then goes back inside his house to his bathtub, but instead of water inside it was body parts and blood. He then soaks up all the bloody water with the body parts before full on eating them. The boy watching ended up vomiting, and before shutting off the tape he heard Tom Kenny's voice saying, "You're next, kid." Tom Kenny being the guy who voiced SpongeBob. Now at number 2 is the Camp Coral Massacre Part 1. So SpongeBob has a spin-off show called Camp Coral that is set to air later this year. Some have managed to get the official reel of the show and decide to download it onto their laptop. It started off with a slowed down version of SpongeBob's campfire song before the title Camp Coral Massacre came on screen. It then cut to the sign outside the campsite as fog began to roll in the darkness and the camera zooms into a younger SpongeBob asleep on top of a bunk bed. Patrick is at the bottom and they both wake up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside their cabin. They decide to investigate, but out of nowhere an image of a woman with her head split open flashes on the screen. As the two go outside, the fog gets worse as SpongeBob bumps into someone thinking it's Patrick. But Patrick's behind him, and after shining the light in front of them, they see this fish holding a hatchet. Dun dun dun. And finally, at number 1 is the Camp Coral Massacre Part 2. Now obviously at this point they run away screaming for their lives as the fish chases after them. The other campers wake up and see what's going on as the fish heads for all of them instead. He hits one in the head as blood squirts on the campers around them. Campers start getting evacuated and the screen cuts to SpongeBob and Patrick hiding under their beds, clearly scared as anyone would be if a fish was wielding a hatchet. As the screaming dies down outside, Patrick gets up to look outside to see piles of bodies on top of each other. Thinking the fish is gone, he turns to SpongeBob to tell him the coast is clear, but suddenly starts spewing blood and falls to the ground. The fish hatcheted him in the back, and despite trying to escape, he grabs SpongeBob. Crying and begging for his life, the fish hits SpongeBob repeatedly in the face until he's unrecognizable and the fish is covered in blood. The last shot is showing the utter anarchy that befell the camp. The end.
Starting us off at number 10, Crepes of Wrath. So this episode aired way back in the first season and is the 11th episode. It was originally meant to be the finale of season 1, but that changed. It has been criticized for being mildly xenophobic, but that's not the biggest issue for those who didn't like this episode. If people watched it as a kid, it could be quite troubling to watch, and one person even called it depressing. For 2 months, Bart is on exchange. He is put to work day and night and says his hosts don't feed him, and he sleeps on the floor. Yeah. So the first season and even the second season of The Simpsons had some heavier plot lines. They were not afraid to go darker. Crude animation paired with well-explored despair isn't exactly a way of describing The Simpsons these days, but it was back then. So there is a lost element to this episode, just a deleted scene. It was nothing too wild, just Bart saying woo to some dancers. But it happened, and that's lost, so On to number 9, That 90s Show. So we're gonna jump way ahead a whole 18 seasons to the 11th episode of the 19th season. You heard it the first time I said it, That 90s Show. Obviously the show title is a nod to the sitcom That 70s Show, and it also tries to be a throwback. The problem is The Simpsons already aired like a bunch of seasons in the 90s. So that already throws a wrench into the timeline. And if you haven't seen this episode, you may be thinking that this episode may revisit old plots or something. You know, make things a bit more complex. But alas, it does the opposite. It decides to rewrite history, just right over the canon. So sure, consistency in such a long-standing show is never a given, but this episode wasn't even that good, you know? It was just another episode of Homer and Marge breaking up and getting back together, but this time all before the kids. There were funny bits, like, don't get me wrong here, but overall it just wasn't enough for me to get over the diss to the original canonical material. On to number 8, The Principal and the Pauper. So this one was episode 2 of season 9. A fun fact, it aired the same year I was born. Another fun fact, on the legitimate Simpsons fan wiki, it is cited as one of the most controversially hated episodes ever produced. Yeah. And it was the last one written by Ken Keeler. He says it's the best work he's ever done, so you know, different opinions. But anyways, this episode is about how Principal Skinner is actually a man named Armin Tamzarian who is mistaken for Principal Skinner. Skinner's mom made the mistake and the ruse held for about 26 years. So then once it's found out and they put the real Skinner back in charge, the thing is, no one really likes the real Skinner back in charge. So then they went to get Armin back and gave him Skinner's identity again, and they tied the real Skinner to a chair on a freight train car and then just sent him off. And then the judge ordered no one to talk about it ever again. So overall, people just didn't like that a major character was always a masked fraud and then the issue was covered up and dropped forever. As before, people just love their canon, what can I say? But let's move on to number 7, Mo Goes From Rags to Riches. So this is the 12th episode of season 23. In this episode, a rag tells the story of its life to the entire town, really. So they were all there for a town meeting because the town hall is full of bed bugs, and then Mo, the barkeep, just storms off because people are making fun of him for his best friend, and in their defense, his best friend is bar rag, but in Mo's defense, cleaning supplies are our best friends right now. So take it or leave it. All in all, the episode centers around this rag weaving a story of how it came to be. So you've heard of watching paint dry, now here's a rag telling you a story. Yeah, it didn't receive great reviews by critics. One critic said it didn't really feel like an episode of The Simpsons, and others said the main plot and subplot were both boring. So in this case, more people are saying the episode may have been better off lost. Ouch. On to number 6, Every Man's Dream. So this is another recent one, the season 27 premiere. As the title suggests, this one has to do with dreaming, and it falls into the old trope. It was all a dream. At one point, you think it is subverting the trope even slightly with a double dream sequence where you think reality is the dream and you go back to your old reality, but then no, it scraps it all. Let me give you some more details. The basic plot of this one we have just seen before. It's even already on this list. Homer's actions are enough to drive a wedge in his marriage to Marge. Then he tries to win her back, you know the drill. In this one, the couple separated and even saw other people, but Homer is seeing his pharmacist Candace, and we don't get an explanation of what Candace really sees in Homer. Like, he's a great guy at his core, but in this episode, it doesn't really show that aspect of him. And also, Marge and the family story just feels like an afterthought. Remember when I said the first and second season were a little more gritty? This episode's content nearly had that chance and then just ignored it. And basically the fans noticed, didn't really like it too much. Let's move on to number 5, Diatribe of Mad Housewife. This one is the 10th episode of season 15. It is scary because Homer is working as an ambulance driver, and honestly nothing bad could have even happened in that situation and I would still be on edge. In one instance, the kids are riding with him. Bart says, "Dad, you've been driving in circles for 20 minutes. And then Lisa says, "Why don't you just admit you don't know where the hospital is?" And then Homer says, "Why don't you admit I know it's around here somewhere?" And that just little snippet is to say that they were lost on their way to the hospital, and that's a scary situation if they were in real life. Plus, Homer is an ambulance driver. That was his job. To know where the hospital. Obviously this is a cartoon. I get it, but still. And yes, lost and scary. It had everything that's in the title. That's all I'm gonna say. Okay, on to number 4, Bart the Fink. So this is from season 7, episode 15. This is the episode where Homer gives some somber, morbid advice. He says to Bart, "Don't let Krusty's death get you down, boy. People die all the time, just like that. Why, you could wake up dead tomorrow. Well, good night." And isn't that what every kid wants to hear before going to bed? So what led to this? Bart accidentally got Krusty arrested for tax fraud, and then Krusty faked his own death. So Bart is thinking it's his fault and is mourning his personal hero. So then Homer goes in, tries to give some good words, but then he says that, so Bart is confronted with the reality of his mortality as he waits for the night and sleep to come to him, and it's a lot for a kid. And so while it's good to remember your actions have consequences, telling kids they could die tomorrow is probably a step too far for me personally. Yeah. So let's move on to number 3, the first Simpsons Treehouse of Horror. So this one aired all the way back on October 25th, 1990. It is the 3rd episode of the 2nd season. So producers thought it would be possibly so unsettling that they had Marge give a warning to the audience that things were going to get scary. She speaks to the viewers and said it is going to be a scary episode and that it may be a good time to put the kids to bed. So for the Treehouse of Horror episodes, the first one in particular, this one was inspired by the EC Comics horror tales. And I would say this is one I would definitely recommend watching, so I will not spoil it completely, but I will say it does reference Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, it has aliens in it, and there are elements of it that I would say make you just feel off, but I'll leave you to watch it and you judge for yourself. But this is one that is scary and I'd say lost to time. It's just so long ago. It's 1990, who's that, you know? Let's move on to number 2, Lisa Goes Gaga. So this one is just the lowest rated Simpsons episode of all time on IMDb. It's also the 22nd season's finale. Basically, Lady Gaga is teaching Lisa Simpson the meaning of happiness, but Dave Rada on Reddit summed up what critics were saying the best. It was released at the apogee of Lady Gaga's popularity, and it was a shameless attempt to cash in on the flavor of the month's popularity. The Simpsons episode damn near killed Gaga's career, and she had to sing songs from the Great American Songbook with Tony Bennett and do live theater on NBC to regain any cultural relevance. And wow, yeah, people were not, that was just really not a fan. People did not like that one at all. But I like Lady Gaga. I think she's fun. On to number 1, Dead Bart. So if you're here, there is no doubt you've heard of this one. The one lost episode, Dead Bart. Ooh. And so if for whatever reason you haven't heard, there's a TV urban legend that there's a lost episode of The Simpsons called Dead Bart. It was an episode where Bart died. And the story goes that if you talk about it, anyone that worked on The Simpsons in those days will try to keep you away from Matt Groening. Apparently, he doesn't like to talk about it. It allegedly happened in the first season, and its production number was given to the later episode, Moaning Lisa. It was hidden so no one would ask about it, and it was a gruesome story diving deep into loss and the effects of grief on a family. It had shots of Bart's corpse, made to look more realistic than usual in the cartoons, and extended shots of the family crying. Just really dark content. But I have to give you all the truth if you didn't know it already. It's a creepypasta, made up for the internet. But we have to give the author credit that they gave enough detail that they really made a bunch of people believe it. They posted under the name K.I. Simpson.